is that reap the benefits of content sharing while maintaining a high level of autonomy and editorial independence. The local, ongoing, and separate collaboration that we looked at in the report is between Charlottesville Tomorrow and the Daily Progress, both in Charlottesville, Virginia. And here, Charlottesville Tomorrow began as a newsletter focused on education issues, and the Daily Progress is the area's legacy print newspaper. The Progress began to print some of Charlottesville Tomorrow's education stories when the newspaper was downsized, and now, hundreds of stories later, they're still involved in a collaboration that's been mutually beneficial. Autonomy and editorial independence. Autonomy and editorial independence. Autonomy and editorial independence. Autonomy and editorial independence. The next model, ongoing and co-creating. Again, ongoing project. Co-creating means they're producing the content together.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this webinar today. I am Joe Amditis. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. And I want to welcome you all today to this webinar about Crossfield Collaboration, new research about how and why journalists and civil society organizations around the world are working together. I'm excited to be here today, joined by the co-authors of the report. We have Hanna Siemaszko and we have Sarah Stonbely. I'm going to bring them up on stage now. If you two would go ahead and unmute and get ready. But before we start, I'm just going to give some quick overview and some tech stuff here. This meeting is being recorded, as you know. You can see in the upper left-hand corner there. We do have the chat open. So while the authors are going over the report and the research, feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat, and I will make sure that I forward them to the authors so that they can respond in kind. We will go over a brief presentation. Hanna and Sarah will give a brief presentation about their findings and the conclusions and the methodology of the report. And then we'll open up for questions about anything you'd like to know about the implications or otherwise of the research. Then afterwards, we'll share a follow-up email with the recordings and materials and documentation. And I'll also be posting links in the chat for you to follow up on and read more. With that, I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Sarah Stonbely, our research director here at the center. Sarah, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be able to talk about our research today with my co-author, Hanna Siemaszko. So thanks for joining us if you're live or if you're watching this at a later date. Again, just very excited to be talking about this project, which has been a long time in the making. So it's really exciting to be able to finally be able to present some of the work and the findings. Before I go any further, I would like to give also a big shout out to Heather Bryant, who worked with us for a long time on this project and was very integral to the work. So I wanted to note her excellent work on this as well. Very quick introduction about myself. My name is Sarah Stonbely. I'm the research director at the Center for Cooperative Media. I've been here for almost 6 years. I've done a number of research projects, all sort of supporting the center's mission to grow and sustain local journalism and collaborative journalism, both in New Jersey and further afield. We've done projects on ethnic and community media here in the state. I've looked at the structural factors that are correlated with success in local news. And I've mapped local news deserts in the state, all of which you can find on our research page. Our collaborative journalism program formally began in 2017, although we were working on organizing collaborations as far back as 2015. In 2017, I published a paper called Comparing Models of Collaborative Journalism, in which I identified collaborative journalism projects based on 2 variables, their duration and the level of integration of the organizations involved. You could see that paper along with other paper, all of the other projects I've just mentioned. Actually, no, this is a separate journalism website. It's a separate website of ours, collaborativejournalism.org, as opposed to centerforcooperativemedia.org. Collaborativejournalism.org houses that paper, the paper we're talking about today, as well as a database in which we've logged over 600 collaborative journalism projects, and we're still logging those. We continue to do that throughout. So I also wanted to mention, just really quick, put in a little plug for our annual Collaborative Journalism Summit. That is coming up in May, and we're doing it hybrid this year. The in-person element is in Chicago, so we're very excited for that. So let's turn to our topic of the day, which is Crossfield Collaboration. I also want to just very quickly say that this research, the Crossfield Collaboration research, was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who asked us to look at this nascent trend, which we were very happy to do. So Crossfield Collaboration, as we're calling it, is a partnership involving at least one journalism organization and one civil society organization, usually an advocacy organization, but not always, in which they work together to produce content in the service of an explicit ideal or outcome. So very quickly, what is a civil society organization? It is, can be an NGO. Commonly, it's an NGO. It can be a university. It can be a civic tech organization. It can be an arts organization. We wanted to define CSO, civil society organization, very broadly to capture the full breadth of this trend of Crossfield collaboration. So that's something that I wanted to note as well. Crossfield collaboration is similar to collaborative journalism, which is collaboration between journalism organizations, but it's different in the sense that the introduction of the civil society partner introduces complicated ethical questions for the journalists around impact and the tension between advocacy and neutrality, which we'll talk more about shortly. But first, let's talk a little bit about what these collaborations looks like and what the projects that we studied, what they looked like. So we looked at 155 Crossfield collaborations involving 1,010 different organizations based in or otherwise touching 125 countries on 6 different continents. So we really wanted to have as global a view as possible. And Hannah's going to talk a little bit about the method, but we really wanted to be sure to capture as many of these as we could. That said, the projects, as you'll see if you look at the paper, really are based mostly in Europe, including Eastern Europe, the US, South America and Central America and Africa. We really based mostly on language shortcomings on our research team. Frankly, we did not find as many or look at as many in Asia or the Middle East as we would have liked to, perhaps in a follow-up project, we'll see. So that's really sort of the breadth of the projects we looked at. The most common topics amongst the 155 projects we analyzed were governance and corruption, climate and environment, and human rights defined broadly, including women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and other rights, other sort of issues involved in that as well. So those are the 3 most common topics of the collaborations we looked at. And as is implied from that, one really does not want to be the subject of a cross-field collaboration, right? Like usually it's looking at some sort of malfeasance, right? It's looking at some sort of, it's using precious time and resources to uncover some sort of wrongdoing by, people in power, usually, right? Not always. And the climate and environment projects are slightly different in that sense, in that they are looking at, sort of longer term trends and things like that, but still usually trying to uncover some wrongdoing or some sort of malfeasance. I'm going to throw it now to Hannah. Oh, sorry, real quickly, one more point about the sort of the sample. Of the 155 projects, the organizations involved, I should say of the 1,010 organizations involved, 60% of those were journalism outlets or journalism organizations of some sort, and 40% were civil society organizations. I do think that number is skewed very slightly by the fact that we had a couple very large projects like the FinCEN files and the Paradise Papers, where there were like 100 journalism organizations and like 3 CSOs. So just something to keep in mind, but otherwise pretty balanced between journalism and civil society. So with that, I'm going to let Hannah talk a little bit about the methodology.
Great, thank you. So the main method we used to find these projects was snowball sampling. So every time we encountered a project and spoke to some people, we were introduced to at least 3 or so projects. And that had its benefits and shortcomings, but it did allow us to certainly gather a lot of information that we otherwise wouldn't have understood. But we did only encounter a certain atmosphere of projects because we were limited to the projects that only certain area of people knew. And because of our language barrier, there were certain areas that we were left unexplored that we would like to continue exploring, like certain parts of Asia and the Middle East that we just were not able to cover because of the context that we had. We did about 52 interviews over the course of 7 to 8 months. And that was I would say the bulk of our where we got our information from. We also conducted a survey we sent about 809 people the survey with 137 responses. And it was a pretty good response rate of 17%. I mean, a little lower than we wanted, but it's still close to the acceptable response rate. The field scan data allowed us to do multiple different quantitative analyses, which supplemented the qualitative data that we gathered from the interviews that we conducted. The database that we used was an Airtable, and it was organized into 4 main objects: people, entities, projects, and countries, which we added later when we realized that countries was such a main staple and fixture of what we were trying to analyze. And every project was connected to at least 2 people and at least 2 entities, a CSO and a journalism organization. The reason that we chose Airtable is that it enabled us to make all of these connections. And we realized pretty early on that everything was highly interconnected, and the world of these collaborations relied heavily on connections with multiple people and multiple entities. To continue, there were some limitations in how much information we were able to access from the outset. Not all of the informations on these collaborations were readily available online, especially when it came to names and contact informations of the collaboration leaders. That was amongst the most difficult information to attain. Sometimes it was very unclear as to who was leading the projects or even directly involved. We relied heavily on things like LinkedIn and Twitter for gathering information or trying to contact people that we were thinking would be involved in these projects, and cross-referencing dates based on timelines and looking for leaders in the institutions themselves, but they weren't necessarily involved, just trying to get information about the projects. So there were some difficulties. I'm going to pass it off back to Sarah. to answer why cross-field collaboration.
Great. Thank you very much, Hannah. That's great. Yeah, so let me give you first a couple examples of the types of projects we looked at, just to sort of give, sort of some more concrete detail if you're not familiar with this type of collaboration. One is a collaboration based in Mexico called between Animal Politico and the civil society organizations that are based in Mexico as well, called El Plumaje. El Plumaje is really interesting. So this is, and I want to just sort of preface these examples by saying that the collaborations we looked at took all different forms. So it was really pretty fascinating to see like the various different forms that these collaborations can take. This particular El Plumaje is basically a space on Animal Politico's website. So Animal Politico is like an investigative journalism organization based in Mexico. They have a great track record of really impactful work. And they, are well known by politicians there who are not, who wish they didn't exist, I'm sure. And what they do with El Plumaje is they basically open up a page on their website just to civil society organizations to publish something like op-eds, but there's no word limit, so they can publish like think pieces, they can publish entire research reports. And I think Animal Politico is very conscious. We interviewed 2 people from there. They're very conscious to keep it open to any legitimate civil society organization that who wants to publish there. And it really is very beneficial to both sides. Animal Politico is very interested in, giving as comprehensive view of any issue that's happening in Mexico as possible to citizens who want to read about it. And the civil society organizations in turn, likewise want to, get their work out there to a more wider audience, which not coincidentally is one of the main benefits of not only cross-field collaboration, but of collaborative journalism in general, right? The more organizations you have pushing out work, the greater the audience will be and the more diverse the audience will be. So this is one example of a cross-field collaboration that we thought was really interesting. The next example is—
Sarah, can I just add on one thing about that last collaboration? Another thing that was mentioned about that collaboration that was so beneficial was that it helped build relationships between the organization and these CSOs, so that if they wanted to do a different kind of collaboration outside of just Plumaje, they have all of these CSOs at their disposal that they already have a good relationship with. So if they wanted to do another type of collaboration, let's say a reporting project, they have all of these other CSOs at their disposal that they already have built this relationship and trust with.
That's great. Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. Exactly. So yeah, not only does it increase the reach of both organizations, but it also, helps build the relationship and build the trust, which is one of the things we found was super important, in this type of work. Another example is one that you may be familiar with. It's one of the very large ones, the FinCEN files. So this project was, super impactful. ICFJ does a ton of great work. ICIJ, they also, I think, did the Paradise Papers all over. They are just like masters at organizing these huge collaborations that involve, many, many news organizations, and then also civil society organizations as well. And this was one of the ones that, again, focused on, corruption, governance, like that type of issue. And they are incidentally also one of the organizations, ICIJ, who's very good at tracking impact. So one of the things which we'll talk about impact in a little bit more detail shortly, but one of the recommendations that we make in the report is that funders of cross-field collaboration build not only impact requirements, but impact funding into the projects from the beginning, because one of the things about this type of collaboration and probably about, sort of peer-to-peer collaborative journalism as well, is that the impact is often very diffuse, and it unfolds over time after the project ends, right? So unless there's, dedicated personnel and funding to tracking impact after the project ends, unless you're like one of these organizations that has all of these resources already, it's unlikely that the full breadth of impact will be cataloged. So FinCEN files. And then finally, just a third example is Censors Africa. Previous slide, please. Censors Africa is a great project that we looked at as well. Again, not totally different, but different in structure again, where there was a citizen element as well. So Censors Africa involves several news organizations, also Code for Africa, and some German organizations who are involved in the funding and the technology piece. And they basically placed sensors all over various places, like in Lake Victoria, where there are a lot of like fisher people die from storms that are kind of come out of nowhere or that aren't anticipated. And they place sensors in these critical areas that will then allow people to be, have a heads up of dangerous weather and stuff like that. So this is a really interesting project. And next slide, I wanted to show, this is common on a lot of the on a lot of projects that have dedicated websites. They will very prominently showcase the various partners involved and their logos and stuff like that, which I think is a really interesting element of these websites. And it gets to one of the things that I'll talk about in a second, which is how journalists who are concerned with the tension between neutrality and advocacy, how they're both trying to be very careful about their involvement in the advocacy element, but also how they are trying to push the boundaries of journalistic practice by being very transparent and sort of applauding and showing in the most visible way possible what these collaborations are about and what they look like. So here you see not only the various logos of the organizations involved, but also some of the people involved as well. And some of the people who work on more controversial projects, like the FinCEN files and other projects like this, do so at the risk of their own lives and the lives of their families. So really, they're doing some amazing investigative work, which and partnering with the CSO allows it to have greater impact, both good and bad, as we'll discuss shortly. So why Crossfield Collaboration? I've sort of hinted at this, but we identify three major drivers of the uptick in Crossfield collaborations over the last decade or so. One is that because of the proliferation of technology in platforms and things like this, information producers, primarily journalists, but also civil society organizations, can no longer rely on their content being seen via the usual channels, right? So you can't just give a press release to the major network news or the major newspaper and assume that most people will see it. So partnering with the various civil society organizations often allows, and vice versa, allows the content to take on various more incarnations than it might have otherwise. What do I mean by that? If there's a data viz person on the team, it allows them to make very engaging visuals or very interactive presentations of the data, right? If there's a journalism organization involved, this is one of the benefits to a civil society organization. Journalists are a big part of their job is being storytellers, right? So they'll put this very important research into a form that maybe is more palatable to people who will come across the journalism incarnation of it. And then the broader reach, right, as we discussed. So that's one driver. The second driver, of course, is resource constraints. The resource constraints faced by newsrooms is very well known at this point. And the increasingly complicated nature of the investigative work that these projects are looking at, right? So there can be terabytes of data, there can be, cross-border elements that are scattered throughout the world. There's one really interesting project, which I'm not highlighting today, but I'm just thinking of where it's called Mafia in Italy, or Mafia in Africa. And it's like Italian and African reporters teaming up to look at the mafia presence in Africa. So clearly like crossing continental borders. And that becomes very complicated very quickly. And then the supplemental skills and supplemental human power that are then required. So this is, again, a benefit of this type of collaboration and a driver. And then finally, there's an increased desire for impact, right? So if you're putting all of these resources, all this time into an investigative journalism story, you want it to have impact. Or conversely, you're frustrated by a lack of impact if you do all this work and it doesn't have the impact that perhaps you had wanted. This has been one of the big reasons why advocacy organizations have always wanted to partner with journalists, but increasingly too, why journalists have wanted to partner with advocacy organizations or with civil society organizations, right? For that work to go further, for the, for it to cross institutional fields, if it's a journalism piece, for it to get into the halls of power in the government, that sort of thing. And cross-border collaboration makes this more likely. So I've touched on it, but I want to just say, and this would maybe go to the previous slide. I don't know if there's exactly a slide on this, but this is talking, one of the big things that journalists we interviewed, especially came up again and again, was the tension between advocacy and neutrality. So especially for journalists who were sort of schooled in the tradition of objectivity, right? Western journalism. And we talk a lot more about this in the paper if you want to, look more closely at this, but, especially journalists who are in the US, Western and Northern Europe, it came up a lot, right? They don't want to be seen as being advocate. They want to maintain their neutrality. They have, and we found through sort of parsing the data that we collected through the interviews was that there are two big ways that journalists sort of negotiate this tension. The first is that they have very specific practices through which they keep an arm's length from the advocacy element of the project. And this includes, the timing of sort of the release, the involvement of the advocacy organization. It includes relationships with, sort of the way that the collaboration is structured. So that, there's very specific roles for each organization or each partner. And then the other way that journalists negotiate the tension between advocacy and neutrality is they speak about these types of collaborations in ways that are consciously pushing the boundaries. So the image that we showed earlier of the branding on the collaboration website is an example of that, right? So they're trying to be very transparent. They're trying to say yes, we worked with a civil society organization and here's the great work we do. And here's all of our data and, go ahead and interrogate it for any bias that you want, but we're confident that everyone stayed within their professional their professional lanes and that this is solid work. So we thought that those are two main ways that journalists especially sort of negotiated that tension. I also wanted to mention, and again, I'm not going to get as far into it as we do in the paper, but we found very interesting differences in this concern between advocacy and neutrality between journalists in the global north and journalists in the global south. So this is something that we observed after several interviews. We kind of started noticing the journalists in, for example, Africa, the journalists in Mexico, the journalists in Southern Europe, even, and then the journalists in the north and the west, who I just discussed, would say well, it's different there. But they would not be as concerned, right? So the journalists in the global south were not as concerned. In fact, they said, I don't have time for neutrality. I don't have time for objectivity. Why would I do that? This is this, and it felt almost like the problems were so urgent, and they didn't have this weight of this tradition, of this what some might argue is even this false goal of objectivity. They didn't have that, so they were much more willing to say, well, yeah, we're going to partner with them. We're going to maintain our neutrality, but we're not concerned with trying to appear neutral, or we're not concerned with what some people might say about us working with them, right? So we did notice that difference, and it was really interesting. And I felt like we had to stop ourselves from writing about it in the paper, because it almost could be its own research project in itself, which is super interesting. Finally, and we are going to open it up for questions. But I'd like to talk a little bit about impact. So this is a huge topic, as I've said, in Crossfield Collaboration, and impact is very difficult to track. This is, again, not new to Crossfield Collaboration necessarily. Some of these same issues come up when tracking impact in collaborative journalism projects as well. Why is it difficult to track? So first, of course, the impact is diffuse. It's much more diffuse than if you're one organization pushing out content versus if you're 10 organizations pushing out content, right? You have to track it through all those different sort of audiences and that sort of thing. And not only that, but it's separated from the entities working on the project by time and space. Right. So not only is it more diffuse geographically, but it's more diffuse time-wise as well. Right. So as we just, as I kind of said earlier, there's going to be, the impact of a project on climate change could be a year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, and it's not really very realistic to think that that will be tracked very efficiently, unless someone is really dedicated to doing so. Secondly, impact difficult to track because the data are often qualitative, and this again not specific to Crossfield Collaboration necessarily, but because it's anecdotes, it's a policy change, it's a if it's on the individual level, it's like a personal story, and it's really difficult to capture qualitative data programmatically. So you can write some sort of software that crawls the web for certain search terms or whatever, but it's just very difficult to do. So that's another reason why it's difficult to track impact from these types of stories. And then finally, the organizations involved, if there are, even if there are 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, especially organizations involved in a project, those organizations probably have different impact measures. They probably use different impact methods, and they have different levels of priority in terms of tracking impact. So this observation was one of the reasons why we recommended, if impact is important to like the funding organization, say, that they build in, specific impact metrics that should be tracked. They build in funding for doing so because, it's very time intensive as well. So we think that, so those were the reasons. And as we started to look for impact from these projects, there certainly was no shortage. But it was clear that, especially for smaller projects where there was probably fewer resources, there probably was impact that wasn't available online or that wasn't tracked at all, and for those reasons. One of the things that I thought was kind of cool that we did was we distinguished between accordant and discordant impact. So, well, first, just to define the terms, accordant impact is impact that is in line with the goals of the project, right? So it's like you you conduct a project about corruption, some individuals are kicked out of office and a policy is changed, right? Those impacts are accordant with the goals of that project. But we also, as we were investigating impact, found discordant impacts as well. And by that, I mean impacts that were not aligned with the goals of the project, often having to do with harm or negative effects on people, right? So individual journalists, God forbid, are murdered, or their families are threatened, or retaliation on a company or a community, right? Those are discordant impacts, which I have not seen discussed anywhere in the literature, but I think it's important because, and then if you think about why wouldn't those be tracked as well, which they weren't, but they did come up. Because, if you're a funded organization, if you're a grant funded organization, you don't want to say we did this great project, and all these journalists were threatened, and, this one community was retaliated against. That's not really the kind of impact that you're going to want to trumpet to the world. So, but, it's important, it's important. So especially for future projects, right, who might be undertaking similar work, it would be nice to be able to guard against that in advance. So we looked at the valence. So that's the valence, accordant or discordant impact. And then we looked at the realm in which the impact occurred. And I'm a big believer in, sort of using existing frameworks to, test them and modify them and make them better. But we didn't see really any, we saw there, and there was a lot of impact work out there, of course, good impact work. But with this particular type, we wanted to distinguish between a few different realms that I hadn't seen. One is on impacts on individuals, but not politicians. And I recognize that this is a little bit confusing, but I felt that it was important to distinguish the political realm from everything else, because so much of this work is directed in that way. Impact on organizations involved in the collaboration. So this is the organizations involved, the civil society organizations and the journalism organizations. Impact on organizations external to the collaboration, but not political institutions. Impact on political conditions involving, including individual politicians and political institutions. Impact on social or cultural conditions, impact on economic, and impact on physical conditions. And we found that the most commonly recorded, I want to kind of caveat that by saying commonly recorded and perhaps not most common for the reasons we just discussed, but the most commonly recorded impacts from Crossfield collaborations were accordant with the goals of the project, and they were impacts on organizations such as businesses or on political conditions. So, this is all, again, like, and in the paper, we give examples of each type of impact and sort of the more general types that we saw. But it really is like the ones you'd expect, right? It's like, this politician was kicked out of office, this policy was changed, this business was investigated for corruption and found, and closed down or something like that. So we did find that those types of impacts were pretty commonly recorded, and again, more commonly by the larger organizations who have the resources to do that kind of thing. So there's a lot more that we talk about in the paper. I'm not going to touch on it all today. I do encourage you to check it out. It's at collaborativejournalism.org/cross-field. And there's a lot more in there, but I'd like to now open up for any questions that might be out there or any thoughts or comments.
Awesome. So we didn't have any in the chat, but I wanted to just dive in a little bit here. And what was one of the most surprising things that you found in the course of your research? What really stood out to you that you weren't expecting, if anything? And that can be either Hanna or Sarah. I can go ahead and dive into that one, but something that really just stuck out to you that you were like, wow, I did not expect this to be, something we were grappling with.
Yeah, I can take that first, and Hanna, please feel free to jump in. I think one of the most, if not surprising, but like exciting findings was just the breadth. Like, we didn't know when we started what, how many of these existed. It was really kind of an unknown because they're not, to our knowledge, cataloged anywhere else in this way. So we just were super excited to continue to find out about new projects. And I should say too, the 155, we really think is just the tip of the iceberg. Because as we were preparing the paper, I had to hold my hand back from entering new projects into the database because we just kept coming across them. And so it really does lead me to believe that there's a lot more of this happening than probably has been written about. And, and then it's a little bit siloed at this moment, right? So, there's a lot of learning that could take place among and between these different organizations. And as Hanna said, they really are, it really is kind of a small world when you get down to it. One of the things that we wanted to do that perhaps we were surprised by, I think, it was the interconnectedness. And, it probably has a lot to do with our snowball sampling method, but one of the things that we wanted to do was, I thought it would be very cool to take all of the 1,000 entities and do some sort of network map. And see how often they work together, who else they worked with, the degrees of separation between certain entities, what was the largest degree of separation. Because I think that there's so much good work being done, and I just couldn't emphasize it enough. Every single person we talked to, every project we looked at was just so great. So I think that was maybe one of the things that surprised us most.
Awesome. Hanna, if you want to add to that, feel free. We do have another question in the chat, but go ahead and add to that if you'd like.
Yeah, I think the one thing that surprised me the most was how stark the divide was in the objectivity debate between the global South and the global North. And that became pretty transparent as we conducted our interviews. I think that was what was the most shocking, to me at least. Anyone has any follow-up questions about that? That's a pretty generalized statement about.
I'd love to hear more about that. I also want to hear anybody who's on the webinar right now, if you want to either unmute or drop in the chat if you've heard this as well. We do have one more question from Carol. They want to know, how should we select an organization for a journalism collaboration? Are there criteria to help guide a wise or fruitful exchange? And I know both of you are going to be putting out helpful one-sheeters like you did with the comparing models research, what makes a successful collaboration or anything. But I wonder if either of you could touch on some of the general guidelines that you might recommend.
And if I could just interject for a moment, I'm also really asking, are there collaborations we should avoid and keep distance on? And how do we recognize that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that one of the things that we found, or a few things we found about, sort of what makes for the most successful collaborations, as well as like what some sticking points are. In terms of journalism and civil society organizations collaborating together. One of the things that's just critical is a certain level of trust and humility. A lot of our interviewees emphasize this because, especially if you're going into contexts that have social unrest, that have political unrest, where like it could be a very sensitive subject, right, in any way, which is almost all of them. A lot of times the civil society organizations have been on the ground for a long time, right? They're based in that community, they have sources in that community, and that's something important that they bring to the project. And they don't want to be compromised by whatever the journalists end up printing, so they want to be able to really make sure that they can trust. And then the journalists as well, because they're sort of don't have that level of knowledge, right? They need to know that they can trust the civil society organization. So I'm thinking of a collaboration that's based in India, that, when they go in, they did a large project on toxic waste, meaning like from phones and like technology and how that's disposed of. Yeah, thank you. And they did this long investigation, and they went to pains to say that how much research they did on the civil society organizations they partnered up with, because they had to make sure that they knew what they were doing, that they were upright, because and if funding is shared, right? So, and I think that's probably true of collaboration between journalism outlets as well. But I think especially in the context of, sort of Crossfield collaboration, that's really important. What to avoid? I think that if there aren't clear roles for the various organizations involved, I think that's something that can lead to problems. So, and if there's not a clear structure, like a clear hierarchy, because one of the differences in that we found between journalism organizations, especially, and civil society, especially like the data tech and the civic tech, the timelines are so different, right? So journalists operate on a very quick timeline in certain cases. Even if it's an investigative project, they're probably, turning things around quicker. Whereas like, a lot of like the civic tech organizations we work with, like there's no hierarchy at all. Like they reject hierarchy. It's a flat hierarchy. And because of this, like any single decision can take like a 2-hour phone call, which could drive some journalists mad, right? So I think that that's something important to look out for as well. Hanna, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I think also transparency about what exactly every stakeholder wants from the outset, that will help build trust between the partners. I think even if you're not really familiar with the organization you're partnering with, if you are transparent about what you want from the outcomes of this collaboration, I think we outline this in the paper. We do outline this in the paper. We discuss Fergus Bell and pop-up newsrooms of organizational structure for every time they do a collaboration, and they are very, I think the word that we're looking for is tedious about how exactly to bring in certain partners and at what stages to bring in certain partners.
They're very intentional. They're
very intentional. It's not necessarily about which partners to work with, because I think it's very easy to spot a CSO that's not necessarily looking out for the best interests of the parties it's serving. But when working with an advocacy organization, and if you have very clear preferences about not wanting to get too involved, you can make those intentions known from the outset if you set up clear parameters as to how much you want to collaborate. And they will make their intentions known as to what they want from the from that collaborations, what outcomes they want. And as long as you're transparent about the interaction, it's hard to get into any difficulties throughout the process.
I want to go back briefly to we got about 14 minutes left before the top of the hour, but I want to go back and touch a little bit more on this difference between, or the debate that was going on between so-called objectivity and so-called advocacy in these types of projects, and what that gap looks like, and what you think, where you think that derives from. Hannah, did you want to elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what we observed was a tension between Western notions of objectivity and what it means to be, what type of journalism is expected, what type of journalism needs to be produced. And a lot of that rejects any ideas of being an advocate and having any type of mission-driven objectives in collaboration. So when we saw a lot of collaborations where it was very deliberately thought about when collaborating with an advocacy organization or even a university to make sure that their this idea of objectivity remains intact. Whereas in other collaborations in places like Mexico, for example, that idea is not necessarily as much of a concern, because collaborations between CSOs and journalism organizations are much more fluid and much more dynamic. And that idea of objectivity is much less of a concern. And there's also a greater reliance on CSOs to act as a resource. That came up in one of my conversations with someone from WJP Mexico. There is this reliance between on the resources from the NGOs. So there's the idea of being objective is very hard. So you have to collaborate,
Thank you.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add, like, I was thinking of Miriam Wells from Bureau of Investigative Journalism, based in England, in London. And I would just refer anyone to her writing on this, because she's very thoughtful about this. She's actually one of the only people, I think, at all to have to be an impact editor. That's her official title. So she's been very thoughtful about this. And because, she's based in England, she does sort of deal with journalists who think about this a lot and sort of want to be very careful in negotiating that tension. So I would refer she has a lot of very thoughtful writing on their website, which is thebureauinvestigates.com.
We have time for about one more question. So we don't have any in the chat, but I wanted to go back to trust.
Mm-hmm.
Trust is obviously very important in any partnership. You have a situation where whether it's documents, data, confidential information, or just general trust and trustworthiness between partners. Talk about the relationship between the partners, and you have this situation where it's almost like a prisoner's dilemma, where if one person defects or one partner defects, the other is or the rest of them are sort of screwed over. Can you talk about the role that trust plays, and maybe any examples you saw where trust broke down or one partner betrayed the trust of the other partners?
So as I'm thinking about, there's this really cool project in, again, an organization based in England, but it's a CSO called Data for Change. And Data for Change, we interviewed a couple people from there, and super great, interesting organization. They're actually journalists turned activists. And what they do is they, again, they're very intentional in how they put together their partnerships, the people they work with and that sort of thing. But they talked to us about a project they did in Afghanistan, where they were looking at child marriage, like marriage of young girls to older people, older men. And, the level of trust required for not only the partners in this collaboration, but also between the collaboration and the people who they were working with, right? So it was a very sensitive, delicate situation. What they ended up doing was they partnered with local CSOs who were based in Afghanistan. They partnered with journalism organizations who had relationships, and they did like a survey. No. They ended up recruiting young girls to participate in like a storytelling workshop. And the prompt was like, write about your hopes and dreams for the future, for your future. And by writing out, their aspirations, a lot of them wanted to go to college, they wanted to do great things, they wanted to be in politics, whatever. And then it was so smart. Then they said that in order to have your story published on this website, the website we're going to dedicate to this project, you have to have your primary caregiver sign off. And who was their primary caregiver? It was always, if he was present, it was always their dad. And their dad, it turns out by coincidence, was the person who also was usually the one arranging the child bride marriage situation. So what they reported when they talked about the impact of this project was that a lot of the fathers were kind of blown away by the stories that their daughters had written, and like, oh my God, we had no idea. Like, I didn't know that you wanted to. And so like that is like just one example of where the trust between the not only the partners involved in the collaboration, but also between the collaboration and the community needs to be really strong. Hanna, I don't know if you had any other examples that came to mind.
I think Hannah's having a little connection difficulty.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Hanna, did you want to add anything? It looks like you're back now. Did you want to add anything about the importance of trust and how it plays out in any of these collaborations that you saw?
I think Sarah brought up the example I was going to use, but yeah, data for change is pretty great. Yeah, no, I think she said everything that I wanted to get across. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I will open it up real quick. If anybody wants to unmute, if there's anything in the chat, I don't see it, but if anybody wants to unmute real quick and ask a question, I'll pause for, oh, here we go. Just in time. Carol, you want to unmute and just ask it, Carol?
Sure. I was trying to figure out how to ask this. I have a fuzzy question about how investigative journalism fits in with this kind of collaboration. For example, I've done stories together with Transparency International in Chile, and there it was clear we could investigate something. We both have the same goals. We both agree on who the bad guys are. But what happens when it's not so clear cut? And what happens when you discover a surprise inside the organization you're working with?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'll take it first, and then Hanna, if you wanted to add anything. This is a great question, and it's true that so many of the Crossfield collaborations we found were based on investigative projects, right? Investigative partnerships, right? So again, like back to the topics that were most common, like uncovering malfeasance, right? It's clear who the bad guy is, as you said. And some were not, right? Like some were just like exploratory, or some are like sort of crowdsourcing things, right? Like the Censors Africa one is like a slightly different example. But you're asking what happens when the partner you're working with, something becomes discovered about them? I don't know. I want to make sure.
Well, I'm just saying that we sort of have to be ready for anything, right?
Yeah. And I think this is why, too, a lot of people emphasize, again, that like the intentionality with which they chose partners and the very clear structure of the collaboration from the outset, because yeah, of course, like things come up, or like the project goes sideways, or like a problem is encountered, and sometimes they don't work too. This is another thing that I should add is one of our interviewees was very candid. He said, well, of course, like the things you see on our website are the projects that were the project, like the successful projects. For every one successful project, there are 10 dead ends. Especially in investigative journalism contexts, right? So we had another interviewee who talked about they were working in Turkey, and they were talking about getting a lead from a CSO about mismanagement and corruption on a construction site, and they thought that sounded very interesting project. They've chased it for months, and it turned out it was the initial data they'd been given by that CSO had been fabricated, and was perhaps like sort of political propaganda in they were trying to like get sneak it in as some sort of legitimate data. So I think that's a great point, and certainly probably happens more often, but it's just not documented, right? Like no one's going to dedicate web space to a failed project. So I again and in the paper there's like a short section at the end, like interesting ideas for future research along these lines, and one of them is looking at failed projects. Why do they fail? What happened? And I think that would be something really interesting to look into as well.
Okay, well, I want to thank both of you so much. I know Hanna is in the UK, so it's a little late by her. So we'll wrap up here unless anybody has any final comments. But I just want to thank you both. The paper I'm about to post in the chat. You can read more about the research at the link that I'm dropping now. Sarah and Hanna wrote a Medium post explaining some of the finer points of it. And we have a link to download a PDF version of that. You can also go to collaborativejournalism.org to stay up to date on all the latest happenings and goings on in collaborative journalism more broadly. And make sure to subscribe to our collaborative journalism newsletter at bit.ly/collabjletter. And I'll post that in the chat right now so that you can follow all the stuff that's happening in that world. So again, thank you so much. We will let you know when the recording and materials are available. Expect a follow-up email and have a great week, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.